Hello everybody, welcome to Snyder's Ingot. Today we got a Soundbox video. And this is 7 more of the most evil athletes. We will get right into it, ladies and gentlemen. Hit the like button, hit subscribe button, comment what you think down below. Let's go.
Before this video begins, if you enjoy my content, please consider supporting on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And $5 a month will get you early ad-free access to all of my videos. Thank you. A couple of years ago, I made a video covering evil athletes. It was filmed mostly with athletes who were at least somewhat known. Names like Karl Malone, Aaron Hernandez, and Oscar Pistorius. A worrying amount of people were defending Karl Malone, saying he didn't deserve to be on that list for being a, quote, deadbeat dad. Completely ignoring the fact that he was on there for getting a 13-year-old girl pregnant when he was 20. But anyway, this list has a...
Yeah, that's why he was on. That's why he deserved to be on there. Yeah, getting a 13-year-old pregnant when he was 20. I don't know how on earth this got spun to being a deadbeat dad. I don't know. Those are people. Look. When it comes to certain people, there will be athletes or performers who will be defended for just people who won't want to admit that their favorite in some way is a bad person. So they will somehow defend it. They will somehow change it. They will somehow make it worse than it is. And that's a problem.
A lot of people that you've probably never heard of, and unlike in the last video, they're all killers. Here are 7 more of the most evil athletes.
Oh, we got 7 with killers. Okay. Let's go.
Del Fontaine's life that went from the high promise of athletic glory to the unimaginable violence of a murder that shocked Britain in 1935. Fontaine was once a respected Canadian boxer, known for his aggressive fighting style and a career that showed considerable promise. Born in Canada, he had earned the Canadian middleweight title twice during his boxing career, once in 1926 and again in 1931. Proving his skill in the ring and gaining respect in the boxing world. Fontaine's career in the sport was marked by a series of highs and lows, as he often fought in different countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom. His early years saw him battling strong contenders, and although his style was aggressive and exciting, it was often criticized for its lack of defensive strategy. Despite these shortcomings, Fontaine's popularity grew, especially after his second Canadian middleweight title victory. As the years passed,
Hey, look. You can criticize him for not having a defense thing. If he's winning 2 middleweight titles, he's clearly doing something right. If you're winning the fight, you're doing something right.
Fontaine's career began to lose its luster. In the early 1930s, he moved to the UK to continue his boxing career, where he fought in several high-profile matches. However, his record began to show more defeats than victories. By the time the late 1930s arrived, Fontaine's form had dropped significantly. His physical condition, compounded by a history of heavy blows in the ring, seemed to take its toll on his mental health. This decline would soon have disastrous consequences. While Fontaine struggled in his professional life, his personal life was equally complicated. In Britain, Fontaine had begun a relationship with 21-year-old Hilda Meeks, a former waitress from Bristol. Though Fontaine had a wife and children back in Canada, he became deeply involved with Meeks. Her dreams of becoming a dancer and her flighty personality were in stark contrast to the rigid discipline of Fontaine's life as an athlete, yet he found himself drawn to her. This relationship, however, began to deteriorate as Fontaine's jealousy and mental state worsened. The tragic turn came in July 1935, when Fontaine discovered that Hilda had been making plans with another man. Fontaine, who had a history of emotional volatility, confronted her. An argument ensued, during which Fontaine snatched the phone from her and threatened the man on the other end. Hilda's mother intervened, trying to protect her daughter, and in the heat of the moment, Fontaine drew a revolver. He shot Hilda in the street as she attempted to flee, and in his attempt to further control the situation, he fired a second shot into her mother, who survived the attack. When Sam...
This guy's crazy. That's crazy. That's some crazy shit. There is no other way to describe it, but that's some crazy shit. What the hell? That is fucking psychotic.
Meeks, Hilda's father, returned home. He found Fontaine carrying his daughter back into the house. Fontaine, seemingly unaware of the full consequences of his actions, muttered that he had, quote, done for her and done for the old woman. In his mind, he believed both women were dead. Fontaine's crime would soon make headlines, but it wasn't just the murder that grabbed attention, it was the identity of the man behind the violence. During his trial, Fontaine's defense argued that his mental state had been severely affected by his career in boxing, and he was suffering from what was then known as, quote, punch-drunk syndrome, a condition now recognized as CTE. His defense counsel painted him as a man broken by years of punishment in the ring, claiming his violent behavior was a result of damage he had sustained throughout his career. Ted Lewis, a former welterweight champion, even tested.
Chris Benoit is a definition of that as a wrestler, by what I've been told. I don't know if that fully fits the argument when it comes to him, but that's what I've been told by him.
Testified that Fontaine's physical state was such that
he was so messed up in the head that it just caused him to be so screwed that he did what he did.
He should never be allowed to fight again, as he was clearly unfit. However, the prosecution argued that Fontaine's actions were not just the result of brain damage, but rather deliberate violence rooted in jealousy and control. Fontaine's previous struggles with his relationships were highlighted, and his behavior painted as the result of a calculated act, not a spur-of-the-moment outburst. In the end, Fontaine was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. The news of the execution drew protests, as people questioned whether Fontaine, already a broken man due to his boxing career, should face the ultimate penalty. Despite the calls for a reprieve, on the morning of October 29, 1935, Del Fontaine was executed at Wandsworth Prison. A crowd gathered.
That's how it should be. If you're gonna get someone by execute, have it be in a few months' time, if anything. Don't have it be years down the line like it is now in fucking death row.
Around the prison, some chanting anti-capital punishment slogans, while others simply mourned the life lost in such a violent way. Fontaine left a note before his death, in which he expressed his heartbreak over his relationship with Hilda Meeks, stating that she had, quote, broken his heart and turned him against his wife. His final words were a reflection of the inner turmoil and emotional destruction he had suffered. A prison warden who witnessed his execution later described Fontaine as, quote, the bravest fellow we ever saw go to the scaffold, acknowledging the quiet dignity with which he faced his fate. Chris Dawson was once an Australian rugby player with a promising career. He played for the Newtown Jets and even represented New South Wales in the 1970s, a time when the rugby league was one of the most competitive and beloved sports in Australia. His athletic ability was undeniable, and he was widely admired by fans and teammates alike. However, behind the scenes, Dawson's life was far from the picture-perfect facade he projected to the public. In 1982, Dawson's world came crashing down when his wife, Lynette, mysteriously disappeared without a trace. At the time, she was a mother to their 2 young daughters,
I guess it reveals that he killed her.
and her sudden absence left family and friends bewildered. In the months that followed, her disappearance sparked intense media attention, and many speculated about what could have happened to her. It wasn't until years later that the full, chilling details of Lynette's disappearance would begin to emerge. At the time of her disappearance, Dawson and Lynette were experiencing marital problems. According to various reports, Dawson had been having an affair with a much younger woman, Joanne Curtis, who was one of his former students. Curtis, who was only 16 years old at the time, had become an integral part of Dawson's life, and it seemed that their relationship was one of the factors contributing to the growing tension in Dawson's marriage. As Dawson's affair with Curtis became more serious, the situation at home became increasingly strained. In the weeks leading up to Lynette's disappearance, Dawson was said to have been spending more time with Curtis, neglecting his wife and their children. It's believed that Dawson saw his wife as an obstacle standing in the way of his relationship with Curtis. It wasn't long before Dawson's behavior became more erratic, and Lynette's friends and family began to notice the growing rift between the couple.
I love the fact that these two had a picture and then there's this guy behind them just kind of like photobombing them.
Then, one day in January 1982, Lynette vanished without a trace. Dawson's initial story was that his wife had simply left him, abandoning their children and disappearing on her own. He claimed that she had walked out the family home, leaving no explanation and no sign of where she had gone. However, as investigators began to dig deeper, holes in Dawson's story started to appear. They discovered that Dawson had been the last person to see his wife, and there were several inconsistencies in his account of the events surrounding her disappearance. For years, the case remained unsolved. Lynette was presumed dead, but no body was ever found. Dawson went on with his life, marrying Joanne Curtis in 1984, but continued to maintain his innocence, and the case remained cold for decades. But in 2018, new evidence came to light that finally led to Dawson being charged with his wife's murder. A podcast called The Teacher's Pet had brought renewed attention to the case, uncovering details that had been overlooked in previous investigations. The podcast explored the timeline of Dawson's marriage and his relationship with Curtis, highlighting the growing tension and Dawson's apparent motive to eliminate his wife. Further investigations revealed that Dawson had been lying about key details surrounding Lynette's disappearance, and investigators discovered that he had made arrangements for her body to be disposed of. In 2020, Chris Dawson was arrested and charged with the murder of Lynette Dawson. During his trial, it was revealed that he likely killed his wife to be with Curtis, and that he had gone to great lengths to cover up the crime. He denied the charges, but the
Did him and Curtis even end up together? I mean this as an actual... I might have missed it if he said it. Did him and Curtis even end up together at the end?
jury found him guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to prison. It's worth noting that while Chris Dawson and Joanne Curtis got married after Lynette's disappearance, the marriage only lasted 9 years before the two divorced, and Dawson later
Okay, so they did get together and they got married, but then divorced 9 years later.
married a woman named Susan in 2003, and the two remained married for 20 years before Susan, presumably, got a divorce in 2023. So not only did Chris Dawson murder his wife so he could be with a much younger woman, but that much younger woman eventually left him anyway. It's a shame he managed to get a third woman to marry him, but at least now it's most likely he'll be alone for the rest of his life. While this is technically one entry, it actually covers two people, as the perpetrators of this particular crime happen to be married and were both athletes. Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan's names are now forever intertwined in a crime that shocked the world of bodybuilding and beyond. Both were well-known figures in the competitive fitness world, famous for their strength, discipline, and seemingly perfect lives. Titus was a respected bodybuilder who made a name for himself with his impressive physique, while Ryan was a former fitness competitor who had also earned accolades in the sport. However, beneath the glimmering facade of success, the two were involved in one of the most horrifying and brutal crimes in the bodybuilding community's history. The crime that would forever change their lives took place in December 2005 and centered around a woman named Melissa James. She was a former personal assistant to Titus and Ryan, someone who had worked closely with them in their day-to-day lives. But somewhere along the way, things took a dark turn. Melissa James's role in their lives began to unravel when an affair between her and Titus was discovered by Ryan. This affair created a web of betrayal, jealousy, and anger that would eventually lead to an unspeakable act. It's believed that the relationship between Ryan, Titus, and James became increasingly toxic in the months leading up to the crime. Kelly Ryan in particular became consumed by jealousy and resentment towards Melissa James. What started as a personal dispute soon escalated into something far more sinister. The situation reached a boiling point when, in the early morning hours of December 14, 2005, Melissa Jones was found dead in the trunk of Ryan's car. The crime scene itself was brutal. James was drugged, stunned with a taser.
How did they find him in his car? Like, how do you just stumble upon that?
Injected with morphine and strangled before she was, quote, burned beyond anyone's recognition in the trunk of Ryan's Jaguar. She was left in the trunk of the car and abandoned in a remote desert area outside of Las Vegas. What made the situation even more chilling was the way in which Titus and Ryan attempted to cover their tracks. Instead of immediately reporting the crime or seeking help, they fled the scene, attempting to destroy evidence and cover up their involvement. They set fire to the car in a desperate attempt to erase any clues that could link them to the murder. For days, they...
Oh, so their stupid asses set the car on fire. Yeah, that's how I got noticed.
Went on the run, evading authorities as investigators pieced together the details of what had happened. But it wasn't long before the police were able to track them down. Titus and Ryan were arrested in Boston after a nationwide manhunt. They were charged with the murder of Melissa James, and their trial would expose the full extent.
That's even more insane because, like, she's the person. You can just stop talking to her, stop working with her, and then you just two go about your fucking business. Go about your lives. Why did this consume them so much? She's mad at him for having an affair, but yet she's not taking it out on him. She's taking it out on her, which for some reason women do. I never understand it. And this consumed her. And for some reason, they just, instead of going about your business, because like the relationship got tossed, like, just stop having a relationship. Y'all can go about your fucking lives. You're not obligated to work with this woman. So weird.
To their crime. During the trial, it became clear that the crime was not a spur-of-the-moment act of rage, but rather a calculated and deliberate act. Both Titus and Ryan had been involved in the planning and execution of the murder, with Ryan taking an active role in the attack. The details of the crime that emerged were disturbing. Titus had reportedly tried to cover up the murder by disposing of James's body, while Ryan had allegedly been the one to deal the final blow that ended her life. Their motives were rooted in a mixture of jealousy, anger, and a desire to eliminate someone who they deemed had become a threat. In 2008, after a lengthy legal process, Craig Titus was sentenced to 21 to 55 years in prison for his involvement in the murder, while Kelly Ryan received a sentence of 6 to 20 years. Their fall from grace showed how a seemingly perfect life in the public eye could hide a darkness no one expected. From the pinnacle of their bodybuilding careers to the depths of criminality, Titus and Ryan's story was one of betrayal, violence, and a shared descent into chaos, all triggered by jealousy, love gone wrong, and a willingness to take a life. Born in 1967, Anthony Smith was drafted 11th overall in the 1990 NFL Draft by the Los Angeles Raiders, who of course would later be known as the Oakland Raiders, an early sign of the potential that had been recognized in him as defensive end. Prior to his pro career, Smith had played college football at both Arizona and Alabama, showcasing his athletic abilities that made him an appealing prospect for the NFL. However, his professional football career didn't begin as smoothly as he might have hoped. During training camp in 1990, Smith suffered a devastating injury, a torn medial collateral ligament and cartilage in his right knee. The injury kept him out for his entire rookie season, and it was a major setback for a young player eager to prove himself. Nonetheless, Smith would return to the field the following year, and after 3 seasons, he signed a 4-year contract extension worth $7.6 million with the Raiders. But despite the sizable contract and his continued presence on the team, Smith's career began to decline as he struggled with injuries and his own personal demons. By 1990,
Fortunately, all love athletes whose careers just go downhill because of injuries. Like, fortunately, in that scenario, you're just not cut out to be an athlete in that case.
1997, Smith made the decision to opt out of his contract with the Raiders, and his brief stint with the Denver Broncos would end shortly after. This marked the end of his NFL career, but it was only the beginning of a much darker chapter in his life. In the years following his departure from football, Smith found himself entangled in a string of legal issues. One notable incident occurred in 2003, when he was charged with firebombing a furniture store in Santa Monica, California. The motive appeared to be related to a dispute over money and a consignment item with the store's owner. However, despite the severity of the charge, 2 juries failed to reach a verdict, and the case was ultimately dismissed by the judge.
That's insane. That's insane. This is insane. More of a who just... You had a disagreement, so you set fire to the fucking store? What the
But this incident...
It's like someone in the city I live fucking set a Molotov cocktail into a fucking gaming store. I'm like, what the f*** are y'all doing? Crazy shit is this?
served as a foreboding sign of the violence that would follow in Smith's life. It wasn't until 2011 that the full extent of Smith's criminal behavior would be revealed. That year, Smith, along with 2 other men, was charged with the 2008 murder of Moriello Ponce, a mechanic who was brutally beaten and shot. Ponce's body was left discarded near the Antelope Valley poppy fields in Lancaster, California. Prosecutors claimed that the murder had been the result of a business deal gone horribly wrong. Smith's connection to this murder was only the beginning of a much larger, more disturbing pattern. While awaiting retrial for the Ponce murder, Smith's involvement in multiple other killings came to light. In 2012, he was charged with the 1999 murders of 2 brothers, Kevin and Ricky Nettles, who were kidnapped from a Los Angeles car wash, tortured, and executed. Smith, using a fake police badge, had impersonated a detective during the abduction. Their bodies were later discovered.
This is psychopathic. What the fuck? This guy lost it.
Dumped in a remote location. The same year, Smith was also charged with the 2001 kidnapping and murder of Dennis Henderson, who was fatally stabbed in Los Angeles. The evidence stacked against Smith was overwhelming. During the preliminary hearing in October 2012, A Los Angeles County judge ruled that there was enough evidence to bring Smith to trial for all 4 murders. His trial for the Nettles and Henderson murders began in 2015, and after 8 days of deliberations, the jury found Smith guilty of both murders. The jury also found special circumstances of kidnapping, torture, and multiple murders, which further cemented Smith's role in these horrific acts. The murder of Mariela Ponce remained unresolved, as the jury was split with a 9-3 vote in favor of a guilty verdict. On January 22, 2016, Smith was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His life, once defined by football and athletic promise, was now reduced to his involvement in a series of brutal and senseless killings. Anthony Smith, the former NFL player, was now serving time for crimes that were a far cry from his once promising athletic career. Alexander Villaplane began life as a gifted athlete, known for his skillful play as a midfielder on various French football clubs. He was born in December 1904 and grew up immersed in a sport that was gaining more and more attention throughout France. In the early 1920s, he made appearances for Sète, showcasing his flair for controlling the pace of a match. Observers spoke highly of his instincts on the field, and it wasn't long before other clubs took notice of his talents. Over time, he would end up on the rosters of 5 different clubs. His journey through these teams allowed him to develop a reputation as a skillful competitor, always seeking the best opportunity to advance his side. National selectors recognized that talent when Villaplane was chosen for the French squad competing at the 1928 Summer Olympics. A couple of years later, he was named the captain of the team at the very first FIFA World Cup in 1930. For many years, that was a crowning achievement, standing on the world's biggest stage as the leader of his country's side. He earned 25 caps for France, an impressive total in an era when international fixtures were far less common than they are today. During those years, he was widely seen as a genuine star, even if his personal conduct occasionally invited a few raised eyebrows. Trouble began brewing for Villaplane during the 1932 to 1933 season, when he was playing for Antibes. That year marked the introduction of professional football in France, and the country was split into 2 leagues, North and South. Antibes topped the table in the southern section, then went on to defeat Lille in the playoff, seemingly clinching the championship. However, an investigation revealed foul play behind the scenes. Antibes was stripped of the title for match fixing, and the manager of Lille received a lifetime ban. Many fingers pointed at Villaplane as well, but the authorities opted for a mild penalty in his case, allowing him to dodge the worst consequences. He then joined OGC Nice for the 1933 to 1934 campaign, yet by that point, his enthusiasm for the game had faded. He spent more time at horse races than he did focusing on his place on the squad. A last-ditch effort to salvage his career led him to join the Bordeaux-based Hispano Bastiene. That endeavour ended in disaster when he wound up behind bars, implicated in a horse race fixing scheme. By the onset of World...
This guy's he just likes to match fix, and he horse races fix, and he can't win on his own. He needs to be fixed for him to win.
War II, his days as a professional athlete had given way to a life marked by criminal associations. He fell in with the Parisian underworld, dealing on the black market and preying on Jewish residents through racketeering. In 1940, a charge of possession of stolen goods brought him a 2-month prison sentence. His background in illicit activity soon caught the attention of the Carlong, a collaborationist group operating in Nazi-occupied France. This organization acted like an extension of the German Reich Security Main Office, working to suppress the resistance with brutal methods. Headed by notorious Paris gangsters Henri Lafont and Pierre Bonny, the Carlong thrived on criminal expertise, and Villaplane slid right in, specializing in strong-arm tactics against gold merchants. Sometime later, he tried to slip away from the escalating war in Paris by fleeing to Toulouse. An acquaintance from his football days helped him secure new identification papers, but that didn't keep him out of trouble for long. In 1943, the SS arrested him for stealing precious stones. He was briefly in prison, only to be freed soon after through connections in high places. He then served as a driver for Bonny before rising to command one of the sections of the North African Brigade, an assembly of North African immigrants who assisted the Nazis in counter-resistance activities.
This is insane. The shit this guy did is actually insane.
Among his subordinates, he developed a vicious reputation, earning the moniker SS Mohammed. His new role gave him both the authority and the uniform of an SS Untersturmführer. The group, under his leadership, scoured different regions, searching for anyone suspected of aiding the resistance. In the area around Emet, Villaplan orchestrated a ransom scheme in which he bargained for the lives of over 50 people in exchange for money. In June 1944, not long after the atrocity at Oradour-sur-Glane, his men executed 52 individuals in Mussidan. Accounts suggested Villaplan himself had a direct hand in the carnage. When the conflict turned against the Germans, collaborationists like Villaplan found themselves in a precarious position. Detention and trial awaited those who had assisted the occupying forces. Villaplan faced charges tied to at least 10 deaths. On December 1st, 1944, a court sentenced him to die. He was executed by a firing squad on December 27th, within days of turning 40. In those final moments, he stood alongside Pierre Bonney and Henri Lafont, the very men who had recruited him into the ruthless underworld. Any trace of the admired footballer who had once led France at the World Cup had long vanished, overshadowed by his treacherous...
That's insane. This guy is this is one of the craziest ones I've ever heard. This is one of the craziest guys I've ever heard. Holy shit.
...actions during the war, and the path that led him to a very violent end. Robert Rozier's name is one that's rarely mentioned in discussions about the NFL, but not for any of the usual reasons. In fact, it's one of the darkest and most chilling stories you could ever hear about an athlete's life after sports. Rozier had a brief and unremarkable career in the NFL. Playing for the St. Louis Cardinals in the early 1980s, he was a linebacker, known more for his potential than any standout performance, but his football career, which hardly even saw him take the field in the NFL, would soon be overshadowed by a series of events that would become utterly notorious. It wasn't until after his time in the professional football that Rozier's life began to take a shocking and disturbing turn. His life took a path that veered completely off the rails, driven by an odd and menacing set of beliefs. In the mid-1980s, Rozier joined a religious cult led by a man named Yahweh Ben Yahweh. This was no ordinary religious movement. It was a violent extremist group that operated under the guise of spirituality. Yahweh Ben Yahweh preached racial purity and black supremacy, and the group quickly became infamous for its brutal tactics.
Are you a dangerous racist cult? Do you hate white people?
All right, that has been one of the general accusations. No, that's not the situation. What we are in opposition to is oppression and immorality. I teach and have taught from the beginning that Satan, the devil, Lucifer was black. As a result, that part of my teaching is not printed or published or talked about. I teach that the devil is in all colors, black, brown, red, yellow, and white. And since we are brought to America as slaves in this country, and since we have been oppressed by white people in this country, it is those that are white that are oppressing us that are immoral. That's the issue.
Hold on, wait, so he's a racist cult towards white people? Is that what I'm gathering here? He's a racist cult towards white people? I didn't think that would be a backlash here.
My teachings basically include morality versus immorality.
Rozier's role in the group was not just that of a devoted follower, but an active participant in its violent activities. Under the influence of Yahweh Ben Yahweh, Rozier became involved in a series of murders. It's believed that he was directly involved in at least 6 of them, though he may have been responsible for more. The group targeted people who had crossed them, often those who they deemed to be betrayers or enemies. It wasn't simply about killing, it was about sending a violent message to anyone who might defy their beliefs.
Someone went against Yahweh, they were declared hypocrites. Then one of them showed up at the temple, he was beaten, tied up, gagged with tape around his nose and his mouth, wrapped in some kind of material, put in the trunk.
Trunk of a car?
Of a car. That's the last I saw him. And I read the next day in the paper that he was beheaded.
The victim was former Yahweh Ashton Green. He was reportedly beheaded while he was still alive. When 2 other ex-members went to police about Green's murder, they were shot within hours. One died. The other is in a witness protection program.
Rozier was part of what would be...
Holy shit! Oh my god! Holy sh... I missed it. What's the name of this cult? What's the name of this cult? I gotta do research. Holy sh... I found a video to dig into. I don't know if it's on this channel or it might be on a different channel, but I'm digging into this. Oh my god!
Become known as the Yahweh Ben Yahweh's cult's enforcers, a group of men who were tasked with carrying out the murders and acts of violence. Their methods were horrifyingly methodical, with the victims often tortured and killed in gruesome ways. The murders were part of a larger agenda to install fear and control in those who were outside the group. Rosier himself would later admit that he had no qualms about taking part in these heinous acts, believing he was fulfilling his role in the eyes of the cult's leader.
That was the day Anthony Brown
Yahweh don't pay daddy.
and Rudolph Broussard refused to move from a housing complex the Yahwehs were about to purchase.
I'ma stay here till I get eviction notice. I don't care what to say. I do, cause they ain't going in. Just simple as that.
10 hours later, after quarreling with staff-wielding Yahweh men clad in white robes, Brown and Broussard were shot and killed. This Yahweh disciple was arrested and confessed to the murders. He was sentenced to 22 years. His given name is Robert Rogier. The Yahwehs knew him as Nehariah Israel.
Was he a close associate of yours?
No closer than you,
Well, I'm in the media. He must have been an enemy of yours in that case.
apparently.
I mean, was he one of a close, small circle of people?
No,
He was.
I don't have a close, small circle. My circle is Yahweh.
Eventually, the law caught up with Rosier and the rest of the group. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. He would go on to confess his involvement, though his motives were disturbingly warped by his time in the cult. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison and has been denied parole twice since then. The horrors of his actions continue to linger in the shadows of his brief football career, overshadowing everything that came before it. Robert Rosier's story is one that can barely be contained within the frame of football. The athlete who once dreamed of making it in the NFL became something far worse. His life after sports wasn't just a fall from grace. It was an all-out descent into darkness, one that cost multiple innocent lives and left a stain that his athletic achievements could never erase. Randall Woodfield was born in Salem, Oregon in December 1950, and at first glance, his early years read like a wholesome small-town success story. He did well in school, he stood out in sports, and his coaches at Newport High School saw big league potential in him. He played football as though the field was his stage, charming local fans who thought they were watching the rise of the next great athlete from their community. Behind the scenes, however, more troubling behavior began to surface. Early on, Woodfield was caught exposing himself in public. Rather than react with alarm, the adults in charge seemed eager to dismiss the incidents as adolescent lapses in judgment. In fact, his very first arrest was deliberately kept quiet so he could stay on the team, preserving the hope that he might go on to college ball and beyond.
That's insane. Look, you can't protect athletes just because if they're committing crimes. You just can't. I don't know why people do this. Why are people protected because they have some sort of skill? It doesn't matter. You're a criminal. That's the end of the story.
His move to college in Ontario, Oregon in August 1970 didn't resolve any of his issues. That same month, he was taken into custody for vandalizing his ex-girlfriend's apartment. 2 years later in Vancouver, Washington, he faced charges of indecent exposure as an adult, but instead of a lengthy punishment, he got a suspended sentence. In 1973, another arrest in Portland also ended with a brief reprimand and more suspended time. Despite those red flags, Woodfield caught a break when he was drafted by the Green Bay Packers in 1973. Heading across the country, he seemed poised to leave his past behind and start a new chapter in professional football. But within a year, after a dozen incidents of flashing, the Packers let him go in 1974. He returned to Oregon in disgrace, his short-lived professional football aspirations undone by his increasingly erratic conduct. In early 1975, a series of knife attacks on women in Portland escalated the situation. Several victims reported being robbed and forced into sexual acts by an assailant. Undercover policewomen set up a sting, and Woodfield was arrested on March 3rd after trying to steal money from one of them. Though his charges were initially serious, he managed to plead guilty to second-degree robbery and received a 10-year prison sentence. By July 1979, he was free on parole. Not long after he was back on the streets, Another wave of violence swept through the Pacific Northwest. On October 9, 1980, someone raped and murdered Cherie Ayers, a former classmate of Woodfield's, bludgeoning her and stabbing her in the neck. The police questioned him, but although they found his answers evasive, the blood type in the crime scene did not match his. With no concrete evidence, no charges were filed. A month later in Portland, two people, Darcy Fix and Doug Altick, were found shot in an apartment. A .32 caliber gun was missing from the scene. Investigators knew about Fix's previous connection to one of Woodfield's friends, but they still didn't have enough proof to implicate him. Shortly after that, robberies and violent attacks.
Okay, so this guy was just a serial killer and freaking robber and criminal that just somehow kept getting luckily away.
Popped up all along the Interstate 5 corridor in Washington and Oregon. A man disguising himself with a fake beard robbed gas stations, ice cream parlors, and restaurants, sometimes assaulting or humiliating victims before fleeing with stolen money. Through December 1980 and into January 1981, authorities noticed that these crimes had a specific pattern. Women were especially at risk, often forced into sexual acts at gunpoint, or shot if they resisted. Some were assaulted in their workplace, while others faced attacks at their homes. On January 18th, two women, Sherry Hall and Beth Wilmot, were attacked in an office building, resulting in Hall's death and Wilmot's serious injuries. The incidents kept piling up, and newspapers started dubbing the culprit the I-5 Bandit. In early February 1981, the violence crossed into North Carolina. In Mountain Gate, north of Reading, police discovered Donna Eckert and her 14-year-old daughter shot multiple times in the head. Lab tests revealed that the teenager had been sexually assaulted. That same day, another clerk in Reading was kidnapped, raped, and sodomized after a holdup. The next day, a similar crime occurred in Eureka, and the suspect, still sporting a fake beard, went on to rob an Ashland motel that night. Law enforcement and media outlets were on high alert at that point. In Corvallis, on February 9th, a fabric store fell victim.
Why do those random sign things keep popping up on the screen? That's so confusing. It's so catch me off guard.
To yet another robbery in which both an employee and customer were molested. Additional robberies occurred in rapid succession in Vancouver, Olympia, and Bellevue, Washington, some involving sexual assaults. And on February 15th, 1981, yet another victim, Julie Rates, a former girlfriend of Woodfield's, was found shot to death at her Beaverton home. Evidence soon led investigators to focus on Woodfield as the primary suspect. By March 3, 1981, he was under intensive questioning. Police searched his apartment on March 5th and March 7th. He was in custody after several of the victims positively identified him in a lineup. Within days, charges began to pour in from various Washington and Oregon jurisdictions, covering murders, sexual assaults, kidnappings, armed robberies, and illegal firearm possession. The first trial, held in Salem, confronted Woodfield with charges of murder, attempted murder, and multiple counts of sodomy. He was found guilty on June 6, 1981, and received a life sentence plus an additional 90 years. By December of that year, a separate conviction in Benton County, Oregon for sodomy and weapons violations tacked on another 35 years. Meanwhile, state investigators looked deeper into the unsolved homicides in Washington and California that appeared to fit his pattern. Although many never went to trial, no matter how promising his future once seemed on the football field, Woodfield gained infamy as the I-5 killer. His series of violent robberies, sexual assaults, and murders painted a disturbing contrast to the local hero image people in Newport once embraced. Even today, there's no clear consensus on the full extent of his crimes, since many cases remain open and unprosecuted, but it's certain he'll never breathe free air again. His life sentence and extra decades behind bars guaranteed that the one-time pro football hopeful will stay forever locked away, a name that people associate more with terror than any sport achievement.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is it for this reaction video. Let me know what you think in the comments, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all for the next one.